Bonsoir, je suis content que vous ayez choisi de suivre le cours de parole sur
The title of the presentation is Restoration of African Greatness. And that would imply that Africa has had a period of greatness in the past, and that somehow this greatness has been lost over the period. And that there's something that we have to restore. The common view, at least in the 20th and 19th and 20th century, that Africa was a dark continent, basically uncivilized savages, until the white people so graciously came to save them and take care
Donc
of them.
aujourd'hui, c'est la classe numéro 16 et le titre c'est sur la restauration de la grandeur de l'Afrique.
Until the Europeans who came and basically
Donc, Govinda est actuellement au Danemark, un écrivain de la théorie de l'utilisation progressive.
Govinda? Yes. Excuse me, but you're going to have to go a little slower. Maybe pause a little bit after each
translation.
Okay. Yes, and they're not, we're doing our best we can with volunteers who are working really hard. Thank you.
So the reason that we do not know, some people know,
Donc,
of course.
Namaskar, merci d'être là pour écouter cette présentation.
Great students of African history, but people in general.
C'est pour titre la restauration de la grandeur de l'Afrique.
It was on purpose done like this. Even many
Parce que cette grandeur a été perdue au cours du temps et c'est quelque chose que nous devons restaurer.
Who is the Regius Professor of History at Oxford University. He wrote in his book, The Rise of Christian Europe, he wrote, undergraduates, seduced as always by the changing breadth of journalistic fashion,
donc, quand l'Afrique était très primitive jusqu'à ce que certaines colonies arrivent prétendant les civiliser, l'Afrique a une très grande civilisation. Elle avait une grande civilisation jusqu'à ce que les Européens arrivent et détruisent cela.
Some few decades ago, pronounced that the infamous Hitler diaries were authentic and written by Hitler, and he had a lot of egg in his face for that, and he was equally wrong when it comes to Africa.
Excuse me, Govinda, you're still showing the title slide, correct?
Yeah. I'm starting now. This is present. It will start to go now. This is just the introduction. Now let us then go and let us now start to look at a little back. We will start this presentation by looking at some of the civilization that existed in Africa before.
Il y a beaucoup de gens qui ignorent l'histoire de l'Afrique.
Europeans came.
Parce que ça a été fait volontairement.
Africa does not only have a glorious history, it also have the most
Des historiens
history of any continent on the planet, because simply
semblent avoir omis cela.
That humanity arose. before the human beings came, we had like pre-humans, like the Australopithecine hominid species. The first appeared.
Un des professeurs a demandé qu'on puisse enseigner l'histoire de l'Afrique. En fait, il y a très peu de choses qui sont enseignées en Occident.
Now, also the oldest remnants of actual human beings, Homo sapiens, were discovered in Africa, and they are dating 315,000 years ago. So for for hundreds of thousands of years, human beings lived in one place and one place only, and that was Africa. Around 50 to 60,000 years ago, humans started to migrate out of Africa and came to Europe and Asia, and so eventually we had humanity spread all over the planet. These are fairly uncontroversial when it comes to most archaeologists and those who studied prehistory. So Africa is of very great importance to the origin of the human species. Around 10,000 to 8,000 BC, that means 10 to 12,000 years ago, humanity in Africa started to become, became farmers. They cultivated wheat and barley. And as early as 4,000 BC, that is 6,000 years ago, they learned the tricks of smelting metals, copper, and other metals, and started to create tools and things with this. Now, this was the turning point from where we could say that prehistory ended, and that's where the history of Africa proper has taken place. So the history of Africa, which is the earliest documented, are in two places. It is Ethiopia and Egypt. Now, we have much more information about the Egypt, so we will concentrate on that, but Ethiopia is also very interesting. Egypt, about 4,500 BC, that's 6,500 years old, started. This is the pre-dynastic period. They were building houses of mud, and the civilization was still pretty primitive. By 3,600 BC, in the dynastic area, they had learned how to make stone buildings that were usually done in square, normal shapes like we have today. They did not use mortar, but they were very careful and knew how to put stones together so they were stable. They used boats for travel. The agriculture was very developed. And a few hundred years later, we see the rise of the Old Kingdom, about 3,200 BC. That was the time where hold on one second. Should have started the timer, so I'm not sure I'm keeping to the format. Okay, so around 3,200 BC, the pyramids were built, and the science and the literature and so flourished. It was a very productive time in the history of Egypt. Science, math, astronomy, medicine, and many other important things were developed well before, long thousands of years before the Greek. And there are Greek texts who confirm this. That is Herodotus, for example, he ascribed the origin of geometry to Egyptians, and there were many who confirmed that their knowledge from the Greek actually came originally from Africa, from Egypt, where they came and studied. And it's a very interesting thing that Herodotus also claimed that Egyptians were the first persons to circumnavigate Africa. Otherwise, we think it's, we've been told that it's Vasco da Gama who did this. But I will read a little quote from Herodotus, who wrote, and you know, he was an old, he was a Greek philosopher, and he lived a few hundred years before our common era. And he wrote, Africa is evidently surrounded by water, apart from its junction with Asia. The Egyptian ruler Necho II was the first to prove this, as far as we know. After he had abandoned the construction of the canal from the Nile to the Arabian Gulf, an undertaking completed by King Darius a century later, he dispatched Phoenicians in ships with the instruction to sail back to Egypt by the way of the Pillars of Hercules, which is the Strait of Gibraltar. They sailed southward from the Erythraean Sea, and when autumn came, they disembarked on whatever coast of Africa they happened to have reached, sowed their seeds, and awaited harvest. Then they reaped the corn and put this to sea again. In the third year, they rounded the Pillars of Hercules and reached Egypt with a report, which may be credible to some but not to me, that as they sailed around Africa, they had the sun to the right. Now, this is very interesting, because if you're traveling westward on the northern hemisphere, then you have the sun to the left. And the Greek did not know at that time that if you went south enough and was south of the equator, if you traveled westward, then you would have the sun on your right. So it gives credence to that, to the claim that actually Egyptians by that time they had able to travel around Africa 1,000 years before Vasco da Gama did.
Excuse me, Govinda. Phoenician and Budavati are both in the interpretation rooms now. If they can unmute themselves, they can interpret for French and for Portuguese. Gudavati, you're still muted. Okay, Govinda, you can continue. Thank you.
The history of Egypt is not so controversial, and even Western historians believe it. But there's a twist. They say that Egyptians are not Africans. They were basically white people who somehow ended up in Africa. And because you could not believe that black Africans could be responsible for such a great civilization, and that which predated the Greek and the Roman, and is the mother of all our science. And that was, but even as early as when the Napoleon's archaeologists entered Egypt, they realized that the ancient Egyptians were actually black, and that okay, I will quote something from Dr. Stanley Sankange, who is a Zimbabwean professor of history who was teaching in the US. But what race were the ancient Egyptians? Negro, of course. Even though there were Caucasians in Egypt at this time, there is nothing to suggest they were more numerous than or drove away the native black population we found in the country. On the contrary, all the evidence point to the to the black population having remained dominant. This was not only the opinion of Napoleon's scientists, it was also the view of contemporaries like Diodorus, Strabo, Pliny, Tacitus, and Herodotus, who visited the country. The Boyce also concludes that the Egyptians were Negroid, and not only that, but by tradition they believed themselves descended from not from the white or the yellow races, but from the black people of the south. Now, why was it so hard for Westerners to accept that the Egyptian civilization came from Africa and it was black? It was because the slave trade was very prominent at those days, and the way you justified slavery was that black people are actually not human. They are a different species, they are subhuman, and therefore, even if you're supposed to give equal rights to everybody, it doesn't count to Africans because they are so inferior that even making them slaves makes them elevates them rather than let them be in their own savagery. This was how the discussions went. So therefore, to then show that all our knowledge and civilization came from Africa was too much, and because that would challenge the whole legitimacy of the slave trade. And this myth has been perpetrated up to the end of the 20th century, where you have white modern ladies playing Cleopatra in the movies and so on. So the idea that Africa, it has changed a little bit. Now in the 21st century, we've actually had actresses that are black Cleopatra because it's becoming more accepted. But the prejudice against accepting that Egyptians were actually black Africans has been very difficult to get away from. No, but it was not only in Egypt that there was a great civilization. There was in many, many places. We will just take a few. I mean, this is not it would be a one-year course in African history if we should go into a lot of it. But let's take a little bit from here and there. So now let's go to West Africa, the Ghana Empire. And the see my notes here. The Ghana Empire existed. There are different ideas of both how big it was and the time it existed. A conservative estimate that it lasted from the 6th century to the 13th century, but some say it lasted for 1,000 years, and some even claim that it lasted longer than that. What is clear is that it was very rich and it traded in copper, gold, iron, and other things, and with Spain and Portugal. Kwame Nkrumah, who was the founder or the first president of present-day Ghana, he was the one who invented the name Ghana for what was then the Gold Coast. And he writes in I Speak of Freedom, he writes like this: for the thousands of years that the Ghana Empire existed, it spread over the wide expanse of territory in the Western Sudan. Its influence far across the Sudan, from Lake Chad in the east to the Futajalan Mountains in the west, and from the southern fringes of the Sahara Desert in the north to the bights of Benin and Biafra in the south. Thus, the Ghana Empire was known to have covered what is now the greatest part of West Africa, namely from Nigeria in the east to Senegambia in the west. While it existed, the Ghana Empire carried on extensive commercial relationships with the outside world, extending so far as Spain and Portugal. Gold, animal skin, ivory, cola nuts, gums, honey, corn, and cotton were among the articles that writers most frequently named. It is reported that Egyptians, Europeans, and Asiatic students attended the great and famous university and other institutes of learning that flourished in Ghana during the medieval period to learn philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and law. It had a strong rulers, strong kings that took for all this trade. They charged custom duties, and through the custom duties, they financed an army of 200,000 soldiers. There was a centralized administration. The capital in Kombosale were covered almost 50 hectares of land, and they had a judicial system, good communications, and so on. So these were not, and this preceded European that came. So it was actually after the Europeans came and imposed themselves in Africa that empires like Ghana Empire started to crumble and disappear. Let's jump to the south of Africa, Kingdom of Zimbabwe. It was also founded in the 12th century, and it was abounded about 15th century, and then it was replaced by the Roswe Empire. It was also very wealthy in trade, and had trading wings as far as China and Persia. What we see mostly today is the ruins of their amazing stonework. It may not be as impressive as Egyptian pyramids, but it still was so impressive that the white settlers when Cecil Rhodes came to Zimbabwe, the white people came. They believed that there must have been a white race who had come and built all these structures, and then later on disappeared, and nobody where they were. They were a big mystery, because again, nobody could
believe. Please slow down a bit.
Yeah.
Guruvati, you're still muted. So no translation for French. Thank you. Go ahead.
So it is this prejudice that Africans were not able to do anything great or so, because they had already claimed that they were all savages, and they tried to remove from the truth that Africa had a great civilization with seats of learning and were pretty advanced long before civilization developed in Europe. Now, we cannot go through all of them in details. Let's just go very quickly a few. You have the Kanem, just to show that there were many of them Kanem Borno. This existed from about 700 up to 1893 in the present-day Chad. And why it was ended in 1893 was because of European invasion during the scramble for Africa, which we'll return to later on. The Hausa states from the 9th to 18th century, they are northern Nigeria, Niger, Burkina Faso, northern Ghana, and like that. You have a Mani Congo, which is now where it used to be Zaire or Congo, Republic of Congo, from the 14th to the 19th century. And there's a lot of travelers from Europe who came during the 15th, 16th, 17th century who wrote about the huge cities, the magnificent organizations, and so there are external documents that prove all these things. You have the Benin, which actually has nothing to do with the Republic of Benin today. This was a Yoruba kingdom that was in the center of Nigeria. Especially their bronzes are very famous, and their terracotta sculptures. The Ashanti was the last empire standing. It was founded by Osei Tutu in 1670, and where he united a lot of African clans who had existed there for almost 1,000 years earlier. But with his high priest Konfu Anoche, they founded the Ashanti, and their headquarters in Kumasi, in the present in Ghana. They traded in the beginning with the Portuguese when they started knocking on the doors, and they fought 5 wars with the British, and most of these wars were lost by the British, but it's the final battle that matters. And the final war was in 1900, where Ashanti lost, and the British were tired of having to fight, so they burnt down the capital and they took all the leaders and exiled them from the country. Now, but then the question is, in all other countries where you've had a great history and a lot of powerful kingdoms and so, they don't just vanish and disappear in history, like totally forgotten, and there's no trace of them. So what was it that broke down and destroyed Africa? Well, it was the slave trade. This is an interesting, just for understand the suffering of it. This is an illustration of how slaves in a British slave ship were stored. This one carried 200, almost 300 slaves, and they were basically packed like sardines, and their head space were maybe 30, just a couple of feet, so they could not sit up. They were lying throughout the whole trip over the Atlantic. Now, the conditions were so bad, so usually 1/3 of all the slaves died, or sometimes half of them. But it didn't matter because the trade was so enormously profitable. So even if half of them died, it didn't make any difference to the slavers. But how did the slave trade start? How come they came to the idea of taking slaves from Africa? Okay, that's also an interesting story. Europeans, as soon as they discovered that there were countries outside Europe, they considered them and treated them as they were their own territories to plunder and use at their own discretion. There was no mutual respect at all. They basically just grabbed and stole and destroyed wherever they put their hand. And that's how they became richer. Take, for example, in the Americas, the history of how they destroyed the Native American population. If anyone is interested, you should read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. Actually, it's the only book I've ever started to read, which I was interested in, which I couldn't finish because it was just too depressing and too gruesome of all the horrendous acts that the Europeans did, and the destruction of all the African civilizations. But in the beginning, they just stole gold, like the Incas, the Aztecs, and they robbed natural resources and so, and enslaved people, and they exterminate them. But they discovered then something that was very valuable. That was sugar. And sugar became Europe became addicted to sugar, and it became one of the world's most valuable commodities. The problem with that sugar required a lot of cheap or even preferable free labor for it to work. And where would they get the labor to do this? The first logical thing was to take the Native Americans, but it turned out they were not very useful as slaves because they had the audacity to die when you put them to work. They got very easily sick because they did not have the estimate, the storage of just one second.
Immunity. They didn't have the immunity.
Sorry, that was some noise. Okay. They didn't have the immune system to cope with even the simplest of European diseases, and that killed probably as many. Sickness killed probably as many as were killed in battle.
Europeans did.
Now,
the destruction of
at
all
one
the
time, a group of Africans were captured in a raid, more for
Mais
curiosity
au
than
commencement,
anything else. And once they got tired of looking
ils
at
ont
them,
volé l'or
they sent them to the New World and to
et certaines
work.
ressources
And they
et
found out
ont
that they were
rendu les personnes.
totally resistant to any disease that the white man had, because
Et ont
especially
rendu,
in West Africa,
ont aussi mis en place l'esclavage.
So the immune system
Ils ont aussi volé leur sucre, qui est devenu plus tard une commodité de valeur. Et la croissance, en fait, sucre avait besoin de main-d'œuvre moins chère. Et donc, la première chose était de prendre les Américains natifs, mais ce sont des gens qui tombaient rapidement malades et qui mouraient vite.
To survive when they're dealing with the with the Europeans, and they were also used to tropical climate and working hard. So therefore, they became the perfect Africans. Turned out to be the perfect slaves in the whole of the world. You couldn't find better slaves than Africans, and therefore they became in great demand. How did then the slave trade, how did they get the slaves? There were many. You could have direct raids where in the beginning were direct raids, and Europeans just went into places and stole slaves, but you couldn't get enough quantities that they wanted. So instead they invented that they started to talk
Et
with
ensuite,
different
des
tribes,
groupes d'Africains ont
and
été capturés, en fait,
created animosity
et
between
ont
them,
été envoyés
and
dans le
gave
Nouveau
them
Monde
weapons
pour
and
travailler.
encouraged both of them
Et
to
ils ont
fight,
réalisé
pretending
que
they were behind them. But then,
ils étaient très
when they
résistants aux
finally
maladies des
they
hommes blancs,
then they start to support one more than the
et
other,
principalement
to make sure
en
that
Afrique de
win.
l'Ouest.
And the condition was that this tribe they won over, they would then be captured and be
Le
given
système
as
immunitaire
slaves
des Africains était
to
très
the Europeans.
élevé.
Once this was established,
Et en fait, c'était le contraire.
they
Lorsque
did
les
not
Blancs
need to go
arrivaient
into
en Afrique
this
de l'Ouest, ils mouraient parce que leur système immunitaire était beaucoup plus faible.
So all they did was have to barter
Et ils mouraient
slaves.
principalement de
Mainly
malaria.
the commodity was guns, rum, and glass beads. You can actually still find some of those in antiquity stores. They're called the trade beads.
Et ils ont donc réalisé que les
And they were very
Noirs étaient
attractive,
beaucoup plus résistants et survivaient beaucoup mieux
and then the Africans had now
et étaient
used to
de
fighting
braves
each other
travailleurs.
and making raids and going for weaker
Et donc les Africains sont donc apparus comme les esclaves parfaits.
This caused now great instability and the collapse of the whole African society. The instigations and the probing by the
Et
Europeans
comment ils obtenaient donc
destroyed
les esclaves?
all the big kingdoms.
En fait,
And
ils ont
even less
encouragé
they
les
were
guerres civiles entre les tribus.
supportive and settled in the same order and started to cooperate with the
Et ils ont
Europeans
commencé
and
à
selling
discuter avec
slaves, because
certaines
that was the
tribus.
only thing that Europeans were interested in at this stage. Over a period
Ils
of
leur ont
300
donné
years,
des
an
armes.
estimated 200 million Africans were taken as slaves. Well, this is the higher level. There are others who claim that it was less, but there's no one who claims that it was.
Et ils ont commencé
it was
à
increased in the
supporter
20,
un
30
groupe par
years,
rapport
but
à l'autre pour
estimated it was as
s'assurer
much
que
as 200
cela va
slaves. And
continuer et
this
que
was the
certains
end
groupes ne vont pas
or
être
the beginning of the end of the
attrapés et
plantations.
rendus esclaves.
Let's take an example of how this could be. John Hawkins. John Hawkins, he made 3 trips to West Africa and stole slaves, took them to to America, sold them. And he made so much money on these 3 trips that Queen Elizabeth I became interested and wanted to support him and wanted to be a part owner in the operation. And as an investment, he provided him with a ship, which had the name Jesus. And with Jesus, he went and stole so many more Africans, and the profits were so great that the queen decided to make him a knight. And as his coat of armor, he depicted the representation of an African in chains. And this was 1516. It was to the 19th century. The slave trade operated continued to operate. What happened was it was basically something we call the triangular trade. You took and stole or bought slaves from Africa and took them to America to work on the sugar plantation. Then the sugar that had been produced were taken and sold in Europe.
Et donc, cela a contribué en fait à créer une grande instabilité au niveau de la société africaine. Et pendant une période de plus de 500 ans, on a estimé à près de 200 millions, que près de 200 millions d'Africains ont été faits esclaves. Et toutes les nations africaines ont été
it went in to finance the Industrial Revolution. You know, even if you want to now make one,
nous allons voir quelques exemples.
You need a lot of money.
John Hawkins, par exemple, a fait 3 voyages en Afrique de l'Ouest en 1560 pour amener des esclaves. Il a fait tellement de profits que la reine Elisabeth I est devenue partenaire de cette opération.
That made the Industrial Revolution in Europe possible. But after the Industrial Revolution had become strong and established, then
Et c'est ainsi que Hawkins
the need for
a été fait chevalier et a reçu en fait un manteau avec des armes. Il a choisi comme représentant en Afrique. Et c'est ainsi que le commerce triangulaire a commencé. Donc, les Africains ont été transportés donc de l'Afrique vers l'Europe et l'Amérique pour travailler dans les plantations de sucrières. Et le sucre était exporté en Europe. Les arbres, les bijoux en verre.
Production is done by large machines. So what they need raw materials and markets for the consumer goods. They also need
Et en
cheap
fait,
labor.
l'esclavage a
It's
permis de financer
much
la
better
révolution
to
industrielle.
force people into destitution so they would work in the factories for very little wages. Because here you could actually pay them less than what you give to the slaves, because you don't invest any money in them. They come freely to your work, and if they starve to death or they get sick or
Et
hurt,
c'est
you just
considéré en
throw
fait
them away and
comme
get
la
other
machine,
workers.
le
So,
cash pour
and another
financer
very important
cette
thing is
révolution
slaves
industrielle.
have no money, so they cannot buy anything. And a capitalist
Et
production needs
lorsque cette
consumers.
révolution
And
industrielle
anything you would
a
give
été
away
établie,
to a factory worker, you know you're going to get it back because they are forced to buy consumer goods, food, and other things that are being produced in the factory.
et donc
So it recycles it.
à ce moment, les esclaves
Line is
n'étaient
that
plus rentables.
the slave trade stopped because there was no need for slaves, and rather it was a burden and a cost on slavery. And
En réalité, l'esclavage a pris fin parce que ce n'était plus rentable.
But why did we have colonialism? It was never intended to start colonies, because what was expected originally is that, am I still too fast, or
Et
are
en
you keeping
réalité,
up
à la
with
fin,
the
dans l'ère
translations?
industrielle, donc les esclaves sont devenus une charge coûteuse et n'étaient plus un atout.
Yeah. So what was needed?
Et les producteurs capitalistes n'avaient plus besoin d'esclaves parce que la production était faite par des machines. Ils avaient plus besoin en fait de matières premières
They thought that Africans would then come and run and start to
et
work
de
and
consommateurs pour leurs
palm
produits de
oil,
biens.
which was very, very important industrial raw material, and work in the mines, and then sell this to Europe, and keep on buying silly things like in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. What really got it started was the textile industry. But the problem was that Africa, India, China, everywhere they were making textiles.
Et en fait, les esclaves n'avaient pas d'argent et ne pouvaient pas acheter quoi que ce soit. Et donc, ils ne pouvaient pas rentrer dans le modèle économique capitaliste, le mode de production capitaliste.
So the problem that the assumptions were wrong. Africans were not interested to work for the capitalists in Europe and to buy their products. So,
et c'est ainsi donc que le commerce des esclaves a cessé et le colonialisme a été introduit.
In the form of imposing colonial rule. It means you took over and run all the countries and then decided just what people should do.
Et en fait, en réalité, le colonialisme n'avait pas été intentionnel, mais l'Europe, en fait, avait besoin de l'Afrique, avait besoin des matières premières de l'Afrique.
They divided up Africa between themselves. Well, actually, that's not true. That was the effect of it. What they actually decided.
Et donc, quand
they said that
la traite négrière a pris fin, l'Europe pensait que l'Afrique, les Africains allaient produire les matières premières moins chères et allaient acheter leurs produits manufacturés.
They just draw the boundary wherever the armies meet.
Mais en fait, Dans d'autres endroits, et des textiles étaient produits de meilleure qualité qu'en Europe, aussi bien en Afrique qu'en Asie. Les textiles étaient de meilleure qualité qu'en Europe. Et donc, le problème, c'était que les Africains n'étaient pas intéressés à travailler pour les capitalistes ou à acheter leurs produits. Et donc, comment résoudre cela?
By 1900, all of Africa, except Liberia and Ethiopia, were
Et donc, la solution est arrivée sous la forme de la colonisation, des règles en fait de la colonisation, des règles coloniales.
And Ethiopia, here, what I wrote there, obviously I got the language wrong, all right? But what I mean to say is that Liberia and Ethiopia were independent.
Et donc, il y a eu une ruée en fait vers l'Afrique. Et cela s'est passé au cours de la conférence de Berlin en 1884, où les Européens ont divisé l'Afrique.
If you look at this map, the different colors depends on who the ruling thing is. The yellow here is
Donc, ils ont découpé l'Afrique, en fait, se sont partagés l'Afrique.
The red is British, and so on. You have Germans, you have Portugal, you have Spain, and even Italian had a little bit here up in the portion of the of Africa. So what then did this colonialization accomplish? Well, it's the two things again. They needed Africa to export cheap raw
Et donc,
materials and to
en
import
1880, seule la province du Cap en Afrique du Sud, la Côte d'Or et quelques autres étaient gouvernés par l'Europe. Et en 1900, toute l'Afrique, en fait, excepté le Libéria et l'Éthiopie, était dirigée par l'Afrique.
They made sure that no industries would be allowed to produce anything in Africa that could compete with European businesses. They were basically only supposed to supply the raw materials that the European businesses was needed, and they needed to make sure that people buy.
Donc en fait, le Libéria était une place que les Américains avaient créée pour renvoyer les anciens esclaves.
Okay, they did it like that. They imposed head taxes on people. It means everybody has to pay tax just because they exist. But the only way to get the money to pay the taxes.
Donc le bleu, c'est les colonies françaises. Donc on a aussi le Portugal, l'Espagne. L'Italie a également une petite portion.
They also then imposed that in order to work in a ministry, for example, you need to wear European clothes. So then you created a demand for European textiles and exports. At the same time, there was a religious exploitation.
Donc l'Europe, en fait, avait besoin que l'Afrique exporte ses matières premières vraiment moins chères.
They suppressed local languages, which were the vernaculars.
Donc, ils ont imposé cette dictature pour être sûrs que, afin de pouvoir avoir cette exclusivité-là pour faire tout ce qu'ils veulent en Afrique. pour être sûr qu'il n'y ait pas d'interruption de commerce entre l'Afrique et l'Europe.
There were no civilization here until white people came and so gracefully took care of their small African
Et ils ont
brothers
fait de
and
telle sorte que
made them civilized. It's
l'Afrique ne puisse
Rudyard
pas
Kipling talking about the white man's
en fait s'industrialiser,
white people out of their
qu'il n'y ait pas de
goodness of their
commerce
heart
entre les autres pays africains.
goes out and helps and civilizes the rest of the world. But the truth is this, the opposite. I think Europeans were the most uncivilized people that ever existed.
Et donc, comment ils ont fait pour que les gens puissent acheter les matériaux qui n'étaient pas de bonne qualité en Europe? Ils ont simplement imposé, en fait, et rendu cela obligatoire pour les services.
But everything comes to an end, and even so, colonial.
Et ils ont également imposé que si on veut travailler dans l'administration occidentale, il faut s'habiller à l'européenne.
Yes, it served its purposes, but
et en même temps, il y avait une exploitation religieuse.
Suppliers, cheap raw materials, imported expensive manufacturing. That was completely successful. But
Et
once
donc, les
these
religions
economies
européennes
the direct rule was also costly.
ont voulu supprimer les langues locales
Pay for a civil administration, and also then you
et les
had
langues
more
européennes ont été
responsibility. You
imposées.
had to, just like in the slave trade, you had to take care of the people that you're saying that are your subjects and which is paying taxes to. And this
Et
became
donc, l'Afrique était considérée comme
so the idea
le
was
continent noir où les gens n'étaient
many
pas
Africans now, in order to be better servants, they were sent to educated
et où les gens
be
n'étaient
at
pas
university, the
émancipés, donc
ideas
ils n'étaient pas
democracy,
civilisés.
freedom, and so there were a lot of agitation for independence.
Et les Blancs ont fait croire qu'ils venaient avec tout leur bon cœur
Pros and cons, it was decided then
pour
that
les
the best thing
aider.
was to give them the independence because African countries were already stuck as suppliers of raw materials and markets for goods. And the colonial administration was no longer needed. It was just costly and expensive.
Et les Occidentaux ont détruit l'Afrique, les Africains ont détruit leur culture.
People who were looking for independence, give them their independence and maintain
Et l'histoire a commencé ainsi avec les Blancs en Afrique.
Economic control, and that's how
Mais après,
neo-colonialism entered into the picture. And so they could basically get what
chaque
they
chose
needed
a
from
une
Africa
fin.
without having to spend and directly be involved in administrating it. So even after the
Donc, il y a des coûts en fait de la colonisation.
Africa was still stuck as
Donc, la colonisation a rendu l'Afrique le fournisseur de matières premières moins chères et les produits manufacturés étaient importés très chers.
Blame all the poverty and any problem that's going on, you blame it on local inept corrupt leaders and say that they are the responsibility for what has happened. When the responsibility really was the previous history, how it was structured, and it was purposely structured so nothing should be able to change even after independence. You make sure you keep the economies tied to and dependent on Africa, and you did this by financial controls through loans in terms of trade.
Et donc, il a été décidé au final que la meilleure chose était finalement de leur donner l'indépendance.
There's much more trade, say, between Nigeria and UK than there is between Nigeria and Togo or Ghana or any of the nearby countries. It's like that all over Africa. But even the neo-colonial had to reinvent itself because the economy has changed from a
Et ils ont fait en sorte de maintenir en fait une forme de dépendance pour c'est ainsi que le néocolonialisme a vu le jour.
In a neo-colonial world, they said they provide raw materials for the mother country and
Même malgré que le colonialisme avait cessé, l'Afrique était toujours bloquée au niveau de l'exportation des matières premières. Donc l'objectif de l'indépendance, c'était de pouvoir maintenir les Africains comme les fournisseurs de matières premières et de fournir des biens à l'Europe sans les coûts en fait qui étaient générés par la règle coloniale. Et ainsi les pays occidentaux pouvaient également se laver les mains de toute responsabilité et ainsi en fait accuser les leaders locaux de tous les problèmes. Et donc le plan était donc de maintenir les économies liées à l'Europe et en utilisant également des prêts.
Pollution became very big, and then as the industrialization went even further, the pollution went down, and this is was claimed in the Rota paper. But it has been proven that in Western countries, yes, it did happen, but it's because the pollution was exported. So all the things that are environmentally degrading, they are much more, and the European
Donc,
countries.
il y a eu une marche rapide vers la globalisation.
Environmental destructions in other countries. So,
et cette globalisation a entraîné une plus grande exploitation.
From the beginning of we start with slave trade and the industrial revolution all the way
Dans la globalisation, en fait,
what lies behind it is the motive of greed.
Il n'y a pas seulement le fait de vouloir utiliser les matières premières, mais d'avoir également une main-d'œuvre moins chère.
It's the demand for profit. Whatever form of capitalism has taken, you've seen that every change.
Et donc, en faisant de l'exploitation sur place, il y a également une pollution environnementale, une dégradation des écosystèmes naturels.
Capitalist economy, all transactions have to make a profit. Anything that is not profitable will be eradicated by market forces, and so profit is what is a driving force of capitalism. But you cannot have profit out of nothing. For profit, you need to exploit natural human
Et en fait, avant
and the exploitation of human resources.
Avant cette exploitation-là, la pollution était très faible, puis a augmenté.
Exploitation of natural resources, which is in a sense even worse than human resources, it goes to destruction of the world, the natural world.
Et donc, en fait, la pollution qu'on observait dans les pays occidentaux a été exportée.
But you can, anytime you like, change. If you can get, you make a revolution, or you can reverse it, and so on. You can actually start to treat people better. But if we destroy enough of them,
Et donc, comme nous voyons,
there will be nothing left to go back to.
And this is what is happening.
On a commencé par
let's
la
think of it
traite
like this.
négrière,
As long as I
l'exploitation
exploit the
industrielle.
planet at the rate or below a rate of the planet can regenerate itself, it's like the bucket on the left.
Maintenant, on va
What is
voir quel
going
est le
out
rôle
is the same amount as the water coming in.
exploitatif du
But if we
capitalisme.
start to take out more from the world, the planet and the planet
Donc, le
can actually
dénominateur commun, c'est
sustain.
le profit.
Then we are reducing the amount of natural wealth, which reduces the productive capacity of the planet, and will end up with a planet that is capable of supporting much less people than it is now. And if we do it too
Donc,
far,
dans le
then the
capitalisme,
whole
en fait, toutes les
ecosystem
transactions
becomes
économiques doivent générer un profit.
there is no guarantee
Si
that
cela ne
the
génère pas de
ability of
profit, donc c'est
the
arrêté.
ecosystem to sustain life will
Donc, le
remain.
profit, c'est la force agissante du
The
capitalisme.
time when we globally started to take out more resources from the world than
Et donc, pour
what
faire
the
des
world
profits,
could
il
use was
faut
in the early
exploiter les
1970s.
ressources naturelles et
Until
humaines.
that time, the amount of
Et c'est
resources
cela
we
qui
were
conduit à une
taking out was
inégalité.
increasing, but we were still within the limit of what was
Et
sustainable,
l'exploitation
because the
naturelle
ecological footprint
sont
was
même
lower
plus
than the
graves
biocapacity.
que
But once the ecological footprint is higher than the biocapacity, we get an ecological deficit, which you see in the red shade.
l'exploitation humaine, en fait, peut être réversible.
And this happens when the economy keeps on growing. George Monbiot said that almost all systems of economic thought are premised on the idea of continued economic growth, which would be fine and dandy if we lived on an infinite planet. But there's this small, niggling, inconvenient fact that the planet is, in fact, finite, and that, unlike economic theory, it is governed by physical and biological reality.
Donc, c'est un peu
So
comme
it is impossible
créer
to
un
keep on growing
équilibre.
the economy exponentially in infinity, because the planet doesn't grow. The growth rate of the
Donc,
planet
on
is
réduit
much,
en fait
much more
la
limited. If we
capacité
grow the economy
productive
faster than what the planet can have,
de la
we will have
santé.
a problem. The Kenneth Boulding expressed it even more
Et donc,
succinctly.
si
He
nous
said,
allons
anyone who
beaucoup plus
believes
loin
that
au-delà de
exponential
ça,
growth
il
can
y a
go on
tout
forever in the
l'écosystème
finite world is either a
qui
madman
va
or
s'écrouler.
an economist.
Et cet écosystème, en fait,
So
permet
what
de
happens
maintenir
when
la
we're
vie.
taking out more than what the earth can
Et lorsque nous
produce?
avons
Let's look
commencé
at
à
a
tirer beaucoup
simplified
plus de
measure
ressources
of
que la Terre n'en
population.
produit,
The green is the carrying capacity of fish, and the yellow is how much fish we take out. It is possible
nous
for
étions
a
déjà
short period
dans
to
la
take
limite
out
de ce qui
more
peut être durable.
fish than the carrying capacity. But when you do that, then the ability
Et
of
ce
the
qui a
ecosystem
entraîné
to
donc un
support
déficit écologique.
to maintain fish collapses, and eventually the carrying capacity
Et
drops
cela
to
arrive
much lower
lorsque
level, which
l'économie
means that
continue de
after the
grandir.
overshoot, there will be an
Et
enormous
Georges Monbiot
collapse
dit que
in our
presque tous
ability
les
to take out
systèmes
things from the earth.
de l'économie,
Now, there was in the 1970s we had
ont d'abord pensé que c'était une idée de croissance
limits to
qui
growth
pourrait
report,
convenir
which made computer
si nous
simulations
vivons à l'infini sur
of
cette
what would
planète.
happen. And the
Mais en
unfortunate
fait, il y a un
thing about that one,
inconvénient,
in the 1970s, there were chance that it had many different simulations depending on what actions human beings should take. This is the scenario of business as usual, that nobody does
parce que en
anything
fait,
about
la
it.
croissance
And
de
the
la
striking
planète est
things
très
is that
limitée.
40 years later, the
Et Kenneth Goulding dit que toute personne qui croit que la croissance exponentielle est infinie est soit un fou ou un économiste. Et qu'est-ce qui arrive lorsque nous surexploitons en fait les ressources?
You have to see the do you see if I move my cursor? Is that shown?
Le vert représente en fait la capacité de production des poissons et le jaune en fait c'est ce qui est pêché.
So we have 2000, 250, so 220 is here. So we are actually at the time here.
Et donc on voit qu'il y a une surproduction.
The slowing down of the industrial output per capita, not
ce qui va entraîner donc une décroissance.
Pollution, how it's going up, the services per capita. We are just according to this projection, we are just on the peak. So this is the next years are going to be crucial to see if also the collapse.
Dans les années 70,
but if it is actually true, it's been true so far.
Il y a eu une simulation
with the capitalist economy,
de ce qui pourrait arriver.
Once the footprint has grown beyond the sustainable level, as it already has, it must eventually come down, either through the managed process, that means we change the way we
Et donc ça c'est le scénario en fait qui pourrait arriver si personne n'agit.
Means if there's no more oil to be drilled, then we will not drill any oil. Or if climate change make it impossible to grow that much food, then we want to grow it. We run out of groundwater, we will also not do it. So it will come down. The question is only how and by what means. Do we do it in a controlled way, or will nature do it for us? And then it will be severe and direct. Now, the question
Est-ce que vous voyez lorsque je déplace mon curseur?
How would we go about doing it? If we try to think that by continuing to follow the capitalist mode, we can restore Africans' greatness, we are highly fooling ourselves.
Donc, on voit ici en fait une décroissance liée aux effets de l'industrialisation, la pollution. Donc, c'est une projection en fait que nous avons ici et nous sommes au pic. Et il y aura certainement une décroissance les prochaines années.
And actually, even it doesn't go for the benefit of Africans. All the destruction of pollution and the toil of Africans, it goes to feed a high living standards in other countries. And it is actually
en fait, il faudrait changer notre façon. Mettre en place en fait un nouveau processus pour une éco-efficacité ou travailler en fait sur la nature. Mais les questions qui se posent, c'est quand et par quels moyens.
It's the same regardless who it is. There are good and bad people in Europe, and it's good and bad people in Africa. The problem was that it was the bad people, the greedy people, the capitalism in Europe that controlled the development.
Comment nous pouvons restaurer la grandeur de l'Afrique?
Exploited the rest of the world. So, if we want to provide a more sustainable way we have to think differently. This is a Kate Rawor's
suivre les
donut,
choses.
which I find is very
L'Afrique
good
ne
in
devrait pas emprunter
demonstrating
les
the
plans du
idea of
capitalisme,
sustainable economy.
parce que le
And here,
capitalisme
the output
conduit en fait à la
is
destruction
the
de l'environnement
for
fragile africain et aussi contribue à perpétuer l'inégalité, la pauvreté pour la majorité de la population.
will destroy the nature, which is the source of all our wealth. But if we shrink too much and we're not producing enough, there will not be enough food, water, energy, jobs, and other things that people need to survive. So the safe space is in this part of the donut where you keep an economy that is big enough to provide for people's needs, but not as
en réalité, le capitalisme n'est pas raciste parce que le capitalisme ne tient pas compte de la race.
And it's growing whether it brings prosperity or not. It has to grow.
Donc le capitalisme en fait est le même, quels que soient les capitalistes.
Sustainable economy that provides the needs for people, whether it grows or not, should not
Donc
really
on a les blancs capitalistes et les noirs capitalistes.
So in capitalism, the economy aims to generate profit for entrepreneurs, but in a proud economy, it aims
Donc en fait, c'était les mauvaises personnes et les personnes véreuses qui contrôlaient le capitalisme.
Capitalism exploits people and planet in their process.
Et donc, même si on veut apporter en fait une nouvelle façon durable, il faut penser autrement.
Equitable society. Capitalism is based on unrestrained exponential growth, but in proud growth, there's nothing against growth, but it has to be kept within the limits that the planet and ecosystem.
Et donc, à l'extérieur, en fait, vous avez les différents points pour l'environnement, le changement climatique, l'acidification des océans, etc.
So, if we want to restore Africa to its previous greatness, as the cradle of both
et les autres choses dont les personnes ont besoin pour survivre sont en fait dans cette partie.
We cannot do it by the approach of the capitalist approach. It will just lead to environmental degradation and inequality. What we need to follow an approach like Prout, which is creates a sustainable economy, which emphasizes
En fait, ce dont on a besoin, c'est d'une économie durable qui va permettre de satisfaire aux besoins des gens. Donc, l'économie capitaliste, en fait, veut faire des profits, alors que l'économie praktiste veut satisfaire les humains. Donc, le capitalisme exploite les gens, alors que le Prout, en fait, respecte les gens et la planète et crée une société durable. Et le capitalisme, la planète, ce dont nous avons besoin, c'est de suivre Prout, qui est un modèle durable avec une économie durable, qui va permettre en fait de subvenir aux besoins des gens.
Writings about history, I cannot comment on it. I can just tell you what the consensus of the science as we know it now is saying about African history and the archaeological findings that
Et
we
donc,
found.
c'est la voie
I'm
qui
not Baba.
pourrait conduire donc à
I just have Baba tells us
la
we should
grandeur de
follow
l'Afrique.
intellect
Donc,
and
si vous
rational
avez des
mind,
questions,
and this information is what is this current state
si
of
vous avez des questions, des commentaires,
archaeological findings that I presented in this book. If people have another beliefs in it, of course, they are welcome to have it. Do you have a written article of book with this
vous
information?
pouvez soit ouvrir vos micros pour les questions ou écrire dans le chat.
It was also, that's why I was asked to talk here. I had another topic, then I remembered I have a book that was written, was called the Restoration of African District. It was published in Kenya in 1990, and I used some of the materials in that book. It is possible that one could republish it, but I don't think it's in print at the moment.
Hello, namaskar.
Namaskar.
Bon, j'ai un peu une question. Je ne sais pas si la sœur Bourvati est en train de me suivre pour traduire.
Sorry? I cannot hear. What's that a question?
Hello?
Yes.
Sœur Bourvati?
Donc, la question, c'est est-ce qu'il connaît le livre de Baba, l'histoire d'un chemin?
Yes.
Baba, il démontre la théorie de...
Bon, je voulais un peu poser la question par rapport
Donc,
à la
la
situation
réponse,
de l'Afrique.
c'est que je ne suis pas Baba et je ne sais pas à quoi dire. Baba dit d'avoir un esprit rationnel.
Économique ou social. Et de l'autre côté aussi, il y a un problème spirituel. Moi, je voulais un peu savoir.
Si d'autres personnes ont des croyances sur cela, et ils peuvent avoir leur propre opinion.
My French is not good enough.
Ensuite, la deuxième question, l'histoire n'est pas un simple enregistrement des événements passés.
His question is unfinished, so let me try to translate it.
Yes, please. Oh, namaskar.
J'ai écrit un livre qui a
Namaskar.
été publié
Nice to hear you.
au Kenya. Le
Africa
livre a
really
été
is the
publié
place
au
of
Kenya.
Africa that we see the problem in Africa in economic level and cultural level, financial level, social level, and even spiritual. So what is the question, man? Finish your question.
Hello, namaskar. Quel est le moyen que l'Afrique peut utiliser pour se libérer de cette... J'ai un peu une question. Je ne sais pas si la sœur Bourvati est en train de me suivre pour
What are
traduire.
the means that Africa can use to free itself from this type of capitalism? So it is a broad question, actually.
I think.
Sœur Bourvati.
Well, okay, I'll make a patent funny kind of reply and say that's to try to implement work to implement proud, but of course that's not the honest solution to this. But the time is to start.
Bon, je voulais un peu poser la question par rapport à la situation de l'Afrique. Bon, avec le problème que l'Afrique est en train de traverser sur tous les plans, que ce soit sur le plan politique, économique ou social. Et de l'autre côté aussi, il y a un problème spirituel. Moi, je voulais un peu
la question est de savoir actuellement le problème traversé par l'Afrique.
So if we say that if there was a possibility for it to continue, then it's probably there's no power that's strong enough to destroy it. But the fact is that
it is now going up against something that is more powerful than it, and that is nature itself. It's bringing in going into the limits of pushing the limits of what nature can manage. And that means that the constant growth that it is dependent on for its survival is no longer going to be sustainable. And when that happens, people will have to reassess the way we're doing things, and it will.
Yeah, the question is, quel est le moyen que l'Afrique peut utiliser pour se libérer de cette chaîne du capitalisme?
Et donc, la question, c'est quels sont les moyens que l'Afrique peut utiliser pour se libérer du capitalisme?
It is not a question between actually capitalism and proud. It's the difference, the choice. If you look at it in length, you talk about decades and ahead, because things are coming to a point. It's the choice between proud or another sustainable economy or total collapse of entire society. Because if something is unsustainable,
donc, je pense que j'ai proposé la solution de Prout, en fait, et j'ai pris du temps pour dérouler tout cela jusqu'à cette proposition, et j'aurai bientôt un livre publié avec les solutions proposées.
There is a question, one more question in Portuguese. They say from Brazil. Once Africa is the cradle of civilization, why Africa didn't give us the first spiritual master? That is a question that is asked. Why the first spiritual master didn't come from Africa since everything? So that is from Umesh from Belo Horizonte.
I don't see a logical link. It's to say because the first person was born in a certain place, it must have the fastest runner, or because someone is that they would have the higher level of spirituality. Who decides where Tarak Brahma is reincarnating? I mean, probably he'll take his place in a place where he thinks.
Et en fait, il ne s'agit pas vraiment de question entre le capitalisme et le Prout, mais c'est de voir quels sont les liens après. Ce qui se fait, c'est plutôt entre Prout ou un autre système durable, ou sinon, en fait,
what we are left with is basically the external superstitions and the jujus and the things like that. But if you look in deeper, I studied in one time.
Il y a une mais je ne peux pas rentrer dans les détails.
30 years ago or something like that.
J'en parle en fait dans le nouveau livre qui sera bientôt publié.
There is one book called The Arkan Doctrine of God, which was written by someone. I forgot.
La question, c'est puisque l'Afrique est le berceau de la civilisation, comment se fait-il qu'elle ne nous ait pas donné le premier maître spirituel?
But the concepts there were very, very close to Baba's philosophy. If you talk about the supreme consciousness operating principles, they were about analysis about how the soul and the mind is structured. It was
La réponse, je ne vois pas de lien logique.
So I'm feeling that all these subtle and the really things that were destroyed. So I'm not saying that they were the greatest spiritual things came from Africa. I have no evidence, but I'm saying that the little hints I see is that there is a possibility that there
qui
was a much
décide
greater
où Taraka
spiritual
Brahma
awareness
et,
than the
doit
same
voir le
people
jour.
have
C'est Taraka
destroyed
Brahma
the
qui
whole idea
décide
of
là où il doit
civilizations,
aller, dans
the
quelle
same people
société.
could possibly also have destroyed the spiritual ideas.
Je ne vois pas de lien de causalité entre les deux.
Once you destroyed the whole culture and everything, there's nothing
Mais
left.
ce que je peux dire, c'est qu'il y avait de la spiritualité en Afrique.
Exactly. And
Et parce que nous avons détruit toutes les religions africaines.
About Egypt,
Et
is the
ce
same
que
thing
nous
that was
avons
said by
laissé
Cheikh Anta Diop, the Senegalese guy.
était
Studied very
basiquement
much Egypt.
les
So
superstitions
after Egypt
externes.
was led by
Mais quand on
by
regarde
some
plus en
Japanese
profondeur,
leadership, you know. So there is strong spirituality which was there from where even mystical groups of Europe
je n'arrive pas à me
later on
rappeler le
learned
nom,
many things and grew.
il y a environ 30 ans.
So I believe there was, yes, as you just
We don't know.
answered.
In Egypt, we have
Il y
a
avait
unique
un
thing
livre
because
intitulé
of the
La
hieroglyphs.
doctrine arcane de
There's a
Dieu.
lot of written literatures, but you see everywhere what we see there is mostly mythology. The same thing.
Et il avait été emprisonné par Kwame Nkrumah.
If we look at the popular level of mythology and all the gods and goddesses, then
Et le concept dans ce livre était très proche en fait de ce que Baba décrit et les analyses sur ce que est l'esprit. C'était quelque chose de très subtil.
And read about them doesn't mean that there was not a deeper understanding of people who are initiated into it and had a much deeper realization.
En fait, je n'ai pas d'évidence claire de ce qui était la spiritualité africaine, mais il y a quelques évidences. Mais ce qui existait avait été détruit. Et donc, il est difficile de dire ce qu'il y avait là. Dada Janalan a dit que ce que Govinda a dit sur l'Égypte a été également repris par Cheikh Anta Diop. Et en fait, l'Égypte avait été divisée par des prêtres. Et les Européens ont beaucoup appris de l'Égypte.
Okay, let's say now, okay, what is the highest level of spirituality? What we are, the worst thing you can call about what you can, when you accuse someone in their view is that they are animists, okay? That's like the lowest religion when you see spirits and everything like that. But if we draw the conclusions of it, you have Descartes, who introduced who is supposed to be one of the great philosophical leaders of Western society, who was totally intellectual. So he claimed that only the human beings, man had a soul, and all the animals were soulless. And to prove it, the point, he took his wife's live dog and nailed it on the board and dissected it while it was alive.
Mais en fait, lorsqu'on regarde même Manel, on constate qu'il n'y avait pas une vraie compréhension de Dieu des personnes qui étaient initiées.
And this has been the leading force of European thinking. Since then, we disregard nature.
Et certainement qu'en Égypte, il y avait aussi une bonne connaissance de Dieu.
Further, we're destroying the whole ecosystems that we depend on for our survival. It is not that we are, nature is a resource for us to benefit and exploit. We are part of nature. If nature gone, we are gone also. Now, so this is our
Donc, Karnak a fait la remarque que l'Afrique doit recourir à sa propre spiritualité authentique. Et l'autre question, c'est les sociétés matrilinéaires ont-elles tendance à respecter davantage la nature?
Very close to the latest realization in ecological science that everything is interconnected and so if you look at the result of following an animist viewpoint is that you treat everything with respect. If you kill an animal,
donc en fait si on prend les animistes,
that you have to take its life, you make sure that the forests and everything are maintained and like that. It was a highly ecological outlook. So if you say it's primitive, but if the result is that we are protecting the world,
il y a quelqu'un qui avait déclaré que seuls les êtres humains avaient une âme et pas les animaux.
How can we say that it's primitive? It is actually much more sophisticated than all our intellectual things, because no matter how intellectually smart they are, if the result in that we are committing suicide, collective suicide, by destroying the very nature that we depend on our survival,
Et cela était en fait la croyance européenne depuis un moment.
Is not an indication of us being being so much superior to the people who are actually doing the things that are the sensible thing to survive. So I think it's not just a maternal. It looks like
en réalité, nous sommes une partie de la nature.
Maternal, patriarchal and matriarchal societies in the past. They were much more.
Et en fait, lorsque vous regardez les animaux qui sont très primitifs, ils disent en fait que tout est connecté. Parce que tout ce que je fais, en fait, ça peut impacter l'autre partie. Et donc, ils sont plus proches de l'écologie.
Okay, now this question about the pyramids visible all around. Yeah, there's a whole history about that. Also, that.
Et selon les animistes, il faut traiter toutes choses avec respect. Quand on tue un animal, on doit demander pardon d'avoir pris sa vie. Donc, c'est un point de vue très hautement écologique.
That might be before 12,000 years ago, which when we start to see history. But it's still, if we look at the long term, we are talking about hundreds of, this is just in the recent, whether it's 12,000 or 30,000 years like that. But what we were looking at the prehistory here, we were talking about hundreds of thousands of years and millions of years and so forth. I don't think.
Mais en fait, l'animisme est plus sophistiqué que ce que nous connaissons ici en Occident.
The greatest pyramid we found is in South America, not in Egypt. So there's a lot of interest in this. And there is an interesting thing. If you look at the latest aerial mapping of the Amazon rainforest where the Aztecs lived, it shows that we only see the forest, but it looks like they actually were huge.
Et en fait, je ne pense pas que c'est seulement lié aux sociétés matriarcales, mais également les sociétés patriarcales avaient plus de connaissances et étaient plus avaient plus de sensibilité par rapport à l'écologie.
Very great. So it's not only Africa, it's many other places where civilization seems to have lost and been abandoned.
Donc la question, c'est les pyramides visibles tout autour de la Terre et sur d'autres planètes, selon nos amis experts comme Sam Osmanagic, sont considérées comme beaucoup plus anciennes que notre récente civilisation.
Any last question and comment? No one will have otherwise. I guess close it here.
on the chat, there is no more questions. Maybe a comment that the class was fantastic. Great research with names and references. It was fantastic. Thank you.
If anyone wants, I just was very, this is just popular, but if anyone wants great their sources and names and where to study, if you want to African history, Basil Davidson is a good place to start. Actually, he's one of the few Western historians that actually, and about the slave trade, he has.
Oui, il y a beaucoup de choses intéressantes par rapport aux pyramides.
Anyway, he's written a lot of. Basil Davidson would be a good way to start to learn more about this. Stanley Sakange, which I also quoted, if you can find the book, because it's a
Lorsque nous prenons l'Amazonie, par exemple,
African
on
saga,
a l'impression de voir une forêt, mais en réalité, ça ressemble plus à un village, en fait.
Which but very relevant on trial for my country is a very interesting and one maybe his most famous book, but I don't know how far they are imprinted. But Basil Davidson, definitely they will imprint. You can probably even get it on Amazon. Okay, thank you very much then, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.